Good afternoon. My name is David Seljak, and I am the coordinator for the Lectures in Catholic Experience and a professor of religious studies here at St. Jerome's University, which is federated with the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario. I would like to begin today's event by respectfully acknowledging that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are situated, in fact, on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. This is the fourth event in the 2021-22 lecture series in Catholic Experience. It is a presentation by Professor Mark Juergensmeyer entitled "What the Taliban and Qanon Have in Common: The Global Rise of Religious Nationalism." The theme of the 2021-22 lectures is fog and light. As Professor Juergensmeyer has chronicled so thoroughly in his many monographs, journal articles, blogs, and media interviews, a fog of information, misinformation, and disinformation complicates public debates around politics, growing socioeconomic inequality, climate change, issues of racism, indigenization, and reconciliation, as well as old prejudices around ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and identity. For the 2021-22 lecture series, we have asked our speakers to help find light in these uncertain and difficult times. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society, an academic research network located at the University of Waterloo that supports research and dissemination of research related to terrorism, security responses to terrorism, and the impact of both terrorism and securitization on Canadian society. So I have asked someone who himself has produced a significant body of excellent research on the topic of terrorism and security, Lauren Dawson, to introduce Professor Juergensmeyer this afternoon. Lauren is a professor of religious studies at the University of Waterloo and co-director of TSAS. So I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you, David. I can't express how happy TSAS is to be able to have this opportunity to co-sponsor this talk. I've seen Mark on many occasions speak over the years. He's certainly in high demand to talk on this topic. Anyone who has done any research into the issues of religion and political violence is probably familiar with Mark's work, and if not, they will need to become familiar with it. He's been a seminal voice on this topic for some time and will continue to be for some time. He also is the longevity of his involvement on this topic. I hope I'm not embarrassing Mark with this, is something that we all admire and find quite remarkable. So let me just say a few words about TSAS. Really, David has said all that needs to be said so far. TSAS is the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society. It came into being 12 years ago. It's a partnership of 13 Canadian universities, 9 different Canadian government ministries and agencies, 7 different international centers, and 3 NGOs. And we do many things, but the bottom line is what we're interested in doing is encouraging and developing further research on issues of violent extremism and the response to violent extremism, primarily in Canada, but elsewhere as well, and how both the attempt to cope with terrorism and security issues around terrorism have had an impact on broader society. We both fund and support new research and engage in exercises of knowledge mobilization. For example, creating various forums in which government officials and academic researchers can dialogue and interact. As you can see, this topic then is a good fit for what TSAS does. Mark Juergensmeyer is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Global Studies, Sociology, and affiliated with Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. As David's mentioned already, but I'll reiterate, he is a highly prolific researcher with over 300 articles and book chapters, and 30 books, which is quite remarkable. As I've said, these works are really well known. A lot of this work is very well known, but he's, of course, best known for his work, Terror in the Mind of God, The Global Rise of Religious Violence, which is truly a seminal text in the field. Recently, he has 2 new books out, which look very fascinating. I'll have to make sure I get my hands on them and plunge into them as well. One is God at War, a meditation on religion and warfare, which is with Oxford University Press, 2021. And then a forthcoming book, When God Stops Fighting, How Religious Violence Ends. I won't say anything more. I think we really want to hear what Mark has to say. So Mark, I look forward to this talk very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be here, and pleasure to be connected with Waterloo. The last time I was in Waterloo, I remember for 2 things: the geese and the snow. And the geese I found quite charming. I can't say the same for the snow, but it is too bad that I'm not there in person and that I'm here in California instead. Hi, it's a pleasure for me to talk with you today about the global rise of religious nationalism. And I want to start with 2 events that happened this last year that grabbed our attention. And one was QAnon, and the other was the QAnon is a kind of undergirding of the January 6th attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And the other was the success of the Taliban in overcoming the government in Kabul and supplanting it, becoming the new government. Now, you're saying these are totally different kinds of things, and to some extent that's true. I mean, there's a great diversity within the January 6th insurrection. For example, the Proud Boys were just one part of the Patriots, and a whole bunch of other groups, people that were not really affiliated with any particular organization, and yet there was kind of an underlying conspiracy theory that's related to the whole QAnon phenomenon. In its extremes, it's just really wacky because it, imagines that there's a cult of pedophiles that are sucking the blood of children, and it's controlled by Hillary Clinton and media figures and people in television. And of course, we know that none of that is true, but in its more basic sense, it posits that there is a cabal of some sort. There's a deep state that controls the government, and that somehow the politics of the country is awry. It's not working in behalf of the true patriots of America. That's the underlying idea. Now, this image is really interesting, by the way. Let me come back to this for a second. This picture of this guy, this QAnon shaman, who for a moment took over the whole Capitol building and was sitting in the chair of Nancy Pelosi, a place where Vice President Mike Pence had just been standing, presiding over the counting of the electoral ballots. And then you contrast that with this picture, which is the storming of the presidential palace by the Taliban. They look remarkably similar. But of course, there's some pretty big differences. For one thing, the Taliban is still there. And the QAnon shaman lasted only a few minutes before he was whisked out of there. And now he's facing a prison sentence of 41 months. So yeah, there's some pretty big differences between the Taliban and the QAnon strategy, but there are also some interesting similarities. In both cases, there was a deep distrust of elected officials. I almost want to say a distrust in democracy, except that in both cases, they thought they were true upholders of democracy. The Taliban thought that they really represented the wishes of the people, and they just didn't trust the elections that they thought were rigged and controlled by the West. And the QAnon people feel the same way. Supporters of Trump refuse to believe that he lost the election because they think the election was rigged. And they think that they're the true representatives of the people. So they are uprisings. They're not exactly anti-democratic, but certainly anti-establishment and the system of governance that we take to be normal in Afghanistan and the United States. And in both cases, their ideologies are related to religion. Of course, you know, the Taliban goes back to the madrasas and the certain Deoband revivalist movement within Islam that then is twisted into a certain kind of ideology of the Taliban, which is very hardcore. It's almost like Wahhabi Islam, very strict and very very controlling, but an ideology buttressed by religion. And to some extent, the QAnon January 6th people also had images of religion in the background. In this case, it was evangelical Protestant Christianity. God wins. Jesus appears with a MAGA hat. The Proud Boys are praying before they go into battle. There's a cross. There's the Proud Boys. There's this sense of God is with us. God is on our side. And of course, it's a particular God, and the images of millenarian Christianity are really in the background of the whole QAnon ideology about the storm that is coming, and that there is a savior figure who will then redeem everyone in this second administration. Of course, it's Donald Trump. And the millenarian Christian vision, it's Jesus, but somehow these things get kind of conflated. And then the third component, which is really quite similar, is that in both cases, they promote a certain kind of ethno-religious group. In the case of the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's clearly the Pashtuns, because if you look at a map of Afghanistan, kind of a crazy quilt, and the kind of orange in the bottom part is the Pashtun area. This is where the Taliban have their power. But by no means is everyone in Afghanistan Pashtun. The people up in the north are Tajik, which is a kind of Persian group. They're way over here, but they're still connected with Persia. They're Sunni rather than Shia, but still Persian Muslims. Uzbeks and the Turkmen are associated with Central Asia. They're Turkish in background. They look different. They speak differently. If you've been to these areas, if I have, you just immediately know that you're among different people. Their languages are different. You speak of Uzbek up here and Tajik here, and the yellow is Hazara, which is a group of people that are nomads from Iran, and they're treated really badly. They're Shia, and one of the persecutions of the Taliban is against the Shia, by which they mean the Hazara in central Afghanistan. Although their language, Dari, has become kind of the language of Afghanistan, but they're a bunch of different people. They speak different languages. They have different religions to some extent. They have certainly different ethnicities, but the Taliban is the triumph of the Pashtuns, just as January 6th is the triumph of white, Protestant, evangelical, heterosexual men, a male-led group that proclaims its dominance, its rightful role within society. You can see this in this kind of ethnic character in the T-shirts that are anti-Jewish, for example, Camp Auschwitz and 6 million were not enough, SXMWE, as if 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust were not. What a horrible thing. What a horrible thing to say. And then not only Jews, but Muslims, anyone who's not evangelical, Protestant, white, Christian, is somehow an ethnic group that's not privileged. So together, these two movements illustrate the global rise of a kind of autocratic ethno-religious neo-nationalism that now has spread around the world. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And the whole issue of religion and nationalism is interesting. And you might say that, well, they've always been related, and that's sort of the case. I mean, if you go back to the very beginning of the nation state, you're talking about the wars of religion that were rife in the 17th century Europe. And then when they came to an agreement at the Treaty of Westphalia, The agreement was basically one of Latin formula, quis regio eis religio. Whoever is the region, there's the religion. So it meant that the king or the state leader of statecraft, whoever he or she happened to be, could proclaim the region for that territory. Now, why was that significant? Because previously, rulers ruled only as far as their armies could extend, and then there was kind of a gray area between one princedom and another. There was kind of no man's land. They were frontiers rather than boundaries. But with this notion that the people of a particular region should be, associated with the culture of a particular political leader, this gave rise to a whole new concept, which we call the nation state, where the idea of nation is merged with statehood. And that meant now you have to draw boundaries, you have to have borders, you have to know where one territory stops and another one begins. It's this seemingly simple formula is looked back at historians as tremendously significant as the birth of the nation state. So much so that we speak of the modern system of nation states around the world as a Westphalian system, going back to this Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. But it wasn't really until the Enlightenment and people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who then gave some kind of intellectual substance to this idea, with the idea of a social contract between the people and the state, and the idea of nationalism as a living political entity, where Locke talks about representative government that will unite the people to the state. So this whole notion presumed that there was a people. And that's where religion comes back into the issue, where there is a common, where you know who the French are, you know their language and their looks and their history and their religion to a large extent. All of these elements of culture defined a people, and that kind of worked well for 17th century Europe. Hasn't worked terribly well for much of the rest of the world, or not very well for the way the world is today. Although the idea of nationalism, the nation state, gets exported around the world via European colonialism. And in the retreat of colonialism, they lean behind nation states, even when they don't quite fit. Let's take, for example, the Ottoman Empire. This was not a colonial enterprise, but it was what was subdued after World War I, when the Great War was between the nation states of Europe and the two great empires, the Austrian-Hungarian and the Ottoman Empire. They lost. So the winners were Britain and France, and they do what they wanted to do with this region, and that is carve it up into nation states, because that's kind of the way the world should be, right? But how do you do that? Where do you start drawing the lines? Well, they just start drawing the lines, and they look like this. Turkey became a country, hadn't been really before a nation. So the young Turks within Turkey went about kind of ethnically cleansing it, getting rid of those annoying Christian Armenians and Greeks, and subduing the Kurds, and making a pure Turkey for the Turks. So you had this ethnic enterprise going on in Turkey, and then the other regions, you just had the funny combination of people in Syria, which used to be Assyria, with mostly Sunni Arabs, but then the Alawites, the Christians were on the, Alawites are kind of a Shia Muslim group on the western part of Syria. They're put them in power. Then Lebanon has got all these different groups, Druze and Sunni and Shia and Christian, and all right, I guess they can figure things out. Palestine, we've got a whole Jewish community there. We have to do something about that, but also, the Palestinian Muslims and Christians who lived there before, but I'm sure they'll work it out. Transjordan, you've got all these different groups. Iraq, you've got three quite different groups: Kurdish Sunnis in the north, Sunni Arabs in the west, Sunni Shia Arabs in the east. Let's all put them together and we'll just call it one country. I'm sure things will work out. Well, of course, they haven't in any of these territories. And you can say that the problems in the Middle East that we have with us today unfinished business that goes back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, where they tried to create nation states. It wasn't just a matter of drawing the lines wrong, because a lot of these ethnic groups were intertwined with one another. It was a question of how do you create the notion of nationhood where there isn't this kind of common cultural entity. You know, the British threw up their hands in South Asia and said, okay, we'll create a Pakistan, we'll create an India, and the two will be separate, and that way you'll be able to get, well, in both cases, they're having difficulty defining who they are as nations. And, you know, the Christians and other minority groups in Pakistan feel terribly left out, and now there's some 15% of India, which is Muslim, is now feeling marginalized by the Hindu nationalist movement that is in power in India. So the whole idea of nationhood has been a problematic one, you know, in the last century or so. And then on top of this, we have globalization. And in a global era where everything is made everywhere and people can live everywhere, which they do, and mass communications and instant connection with the rest of the world, the whole idea of these defining peoples into nation state becomes increasingly problematic. And you see recently with the enormous number of refugees, this is in Syria, flooding out from the territory, and recently refugees flooding out from Ukraine and other parts of Europe. And I must say the Ukrainians have been treated and received much better than the Syrians have. But in all cases, they then kind of change the equation of the countries into which they go, because you used to know who the French were, and now you've got all these Algerians, and you've got all the, then Germany, you used to know who the Germans were, but all these Turks and the Syrians are coming in. They say that they're Germans. Well, yeah, in many cases, you've got kids growing up now born in these ethnic communities, and they feel like they're German or they're French. And they are in terms of their citizenship. But you can see the challenge this gives to the more traditional notions of what a French nation or German nation was. And we feel the same things happening in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada, but also there, where these are North American countries that thought that they were really extensions of Europe and white European societies. And now the diversity of cultures that are now part of both the United States and Canada has at least some people within those countries feeling that things are going awry, that they're just, you know, it's not right. It's not the America or Canada that they were used to and they expected it to be. So you can see why in this era we're seeing this global rise of ethno-religious neo-nationalism, an attempt to try to redefine a nation state in a more ethnically cleansed way, a way of sort of purifying it. Okay, you know, we can't take all of this multiculturalism. We have to define the nation state in a way that we think is appropriate to, at least in our minds, appropriate to what it's supposed to be. But that often means marginalizing minority groups and making a kind of pariah status of people who have, after all, lived and worked and have been part of a culture for some time, and yet other people feel like they don't really belong there. So we've had a whole series of uprisings, of movements of ethno-religious nationalism, beginning with Iran in 1978. The Ayatollah was not only against the excesses of Shah, but against something he called West toxification, and being inebriated with things Western. He saw that the young people and the culture of Iran was being corrupted by this modernization and globalization, influences of the West that he wanted to purify it from. In Afghanistan, they were waging war against the Mujahideen, in the 1980s, against the Soviet-supported secular government. And they gained power, the Mujahideen, and of course now Taliban, who are their successors, by this notion that foreigners are trying to come in and make it into Afghanistan, into a foreign country, and we want to make it Afghanistan for the Afghans. Of course, as we've seen, it's a particular kind of Afghans. It's the Pashtuns. They have their own definition of a certain kind of religion. And that's one of the characteristics of these ethno-nationalist movements, to want to redefine a nation state in its own terms as a way of kind of solidifying a culture, of making its ethno-nationalist mark. I got interested in this whole subject of study when the uprising developed in the Punjab in India, because I had lived in this part of India for a number of years, and I had taught young people, young Jat Sikhs in the Punjab who then may have joined this movement. And to me, it was not just an intellectual study, although I've always been interested in the intersection of religion and politics. It was also a personal one. I wanted to know how this awful spiral of violence developed between young Jat Sikh men and the Indian government, led by this guy, Janal Singh Bhindranwale. And a common refrain you heard was that, well, when the British divided Pakistan and India, the Muslims got Pakistan, the Hindus got India. What did we Sikhs get? We need to have Khalistan, the land of the pure. We have a land for Sikhs. So this idea of trying to reclaim nationalism in ethnic terms. Israel, of course, was founded in some ways to be a haven for Jews after the horrors of the Holocaust, but it was a secular nation. It was constitutional, it was quite secular, but that's what this guy, Meir Kahane, hated. A leader of a movement that thought that as Meir Kahane told me when I interviewed him in Jerusalem, that Israel would not be Israel until it was biblical Israel, which means that you had to get rid of those annoying Palestinians. They're in biblical land. So, he had nothing against Palestinians. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And sorry, you're just going to have to leave. Now, Kahane was killed a number of years ago by Muslims whom I had interviewed because of their association with the attack on the World Trade Center. But now there's a whole new group. There's this guy, for example, whose name is also Meir Ettinger. His last name is not Kahane, but his mother's was. He's the grandson of Meir Kahane. And this was just 2 years ago in Israel when he was being arrested for terrorism. Netanyahu called him a Jewish terrorist because as a leader of the Hilltop Gang of young settler youth, he was advocating getting rid of the Palestinians, and they were firebombing Palestinian homes in the valleys and burning them alive to try to force them to leave, with this idea to make Israel an ethnically cleansed Jewish Israel. Now, the interesting thing is some of the same kind of dynamics was happening within the Palestinian movement. In the early 1990s, when I was talking with Meir Kahane, I was also talking with this guy, Sheikh Yassin, who was bringing a Muslim dimension to the Palestinian movement. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was very much of a secularist. He was Muslim, but he was married to a Christian, a Palestinian Christian. But there was nothing particularly religious about Yasser Arafat. But Sheikh Yassin, when I talked with him in the early 1990s, told me that Palestine would never be free until it was a Muslim state. So in a remarkable way, in the early 1990s, the struggle between the Palestinians and Israelis, which previously had been pretty much a struggle over land and how to organize it in a way in which two peoples can share the same space, became a religious conflict, became religionized. And you're saying, oh, those Jews and Muslims have been at each other's throats forever. No, they haven't. This is a fairly new phenomenon, the religionization of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, with these strident positions on both sides. The majority of Palestinians don't support Sheikh Yassin. The majority of Jews do not support Meir Kahane and this kind of extremism. And yet these strident voices are loud ones, and they do in some ways define the character of the struggle right now, or make it more difficult for the more moderate leaders on both sides to come to some kind of consensus. After all, the great Prime Minister of of Israel who dared to sign a peace agreement with the Palestinians was killed by a Jewish activist. So the religionization of conflict is one that has emerged around the world. Just over the border from Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was begun in the 1930s with Hassan al-Banna, but gained strength over the years and came finally to a point after Mubarak was ousted to a point of leadership, now of course been supplanted by al-Sisi, but still it shows the strength of this movement of trying to define Egyptian nationalists in religious terms. And then you have the transnational visions of people like the leaders of Al-Qaeda, who they have no particular nation state in mind other than a sort of a large transnational vision of an entity, of a Muslim entity that would be greater than the narrow nation states of the Western model. And the Islamic State also presented a similar kind of notion that there should be a caliphate greater than Iraq or Syria, or actually any of the other countries of the Levant, the area of the Arabian Peninsula. That there should be an Islamic State, a new sort of transnational entity under the leadership of this man, Baghdadi. And for a couple of years, they actually did have territory under their control. They actually did have an Islamic State until it was territorially defeated, although the movement continues to live on in guerrilla warfare. And when I talk with some of the people who had previously supported the movement in Mosul and now in refugee camps, including people who were more hardcore and interviewed in prison, one of the first things they told me was that ISIS, had kind of an apocalyptic religious vision, but it was also a Sunni Arab religion. By that they meant that Iraq, remember we talked about how Iraq was, a combination of Kurdish Sunnis in the north, of Arab Sunnis in the west, and Shia Arabs in the east. And they saw the new Iraq government as being a government for the Shia because they were the majority of people within Iraq. And, when George Bush proclaimed democratic rule in Iraq, they said, oh, we know what that means. That means the Shia are going to be empowered over us Sunnis. So this movement of Islamic State, most people like this guy saw as empowering Sunnis. He didn't care for the religious aspects of it, but he wanted to get on board something that would give Sunnis dignity and pride and, a kind of power in the way that the Islamic State, at least for a period of time, allowed it to be. So it was kind of nation building in their notion of a Sunnistan that would give a power in symbolic as well as real ways, at least for a period of time, to people who felt disenfranchised and marginalized. Some of the same is true of Boko Haram. I mean, they're a kind of crazy extreme group, and that's the way most of us regard them, but they're also spokespeople for the rights of northern Nigeria, the Muslim tribal groups of the north who feel disenfranchised over the Christian tribal groups of the southern part of Nigeria. There's an attempt to try to claim an ethnic nationalism for Boko Haram. And the same is true even in Buddhist countries. You're saying Buddhism, that's the peaceful religion, right? It believes in nonviolence. Well, here are these monks, chanting and protesting, and a number of them carrying firebombs into the Muslim territory, the Rohingya, and setting houses on fire and killing Muslims, burning them alive in just most cruel ways, and being egged on by this monk, Asha Waratu, whom Time magazine put on the cover of its international edition as the Buddhist face of terror. Well, I happened to be in Myanmar, so I went up to Mandalay at the time, and just after the cover of the magazine came out, and I talked with Asha Waratu. One of the first things he said when I came into his office was, "Do I look like a terrorist?" And then he kind of giggled. Felt like saying, "Yeah, actually, you look like all the other terrorists I've interviewed," which is to say quite banal. I mean, what is it? What is a terrorist supposed to look like? I mean, in his case, kept on saying, oh, we Buddhists believe in nonviolence. I said, yeah, yeah. And he said, yes, we Buddhists believe it. We really believe in nonviolence. I said, sure, sure. Then I said, but you also believe in defending Buddhism. And he said, yes, yes, we need to defend Buddhism. I said, ah. I said, and defend Buddhism against whom? And he said, well, because those are enemies of Buddhism. And I said, well, who are those enemies? He said, the Muslims. Those Muslims, they're out to do in Buddhism. And then he had this map on the wall. He was very observant about current events and following particularly, you know, ISIS and Al Qaeda and these movements he thought were out to do in the rest of the world. And this map had this enormous wash of Islam. The territory is controlled by Islam. And then there was this little blue marked territory, which was Burmese Buddhism. He regarded Burmese Buddhism as a particular kind of Buddhism. He said, look, you know, we're just a tiny little drop in the ocean and we're in peril of being forever swept away. That was his notion of how the great Muslim threat wasn't just the Rohingya, which after all, just a small fraction of the population in Myanmar, but it was this larger vision of global politics that he feared, and this need to create an ethnic nationalism that would promote Buddhism in Burma. And then, of course, in North America and Europe, we had the rise of a militant Christian right. It's been going on for a while. I mean, you know, the RN Nation, Timothy McVeigh, who bombed the Oklahoma City Federal Building, was if you read the Turner Diaries, which is his favorite book, he was trying to protect Christendom. He wasn't into church religion, but he was into the whole idea of this kind of Christian ethnic identity, white Christian ethnic identity. The same kind of thing that motivated Anders Breivik in Norway, the guy who shot up a whole camp of youth near Oslo who were affiliated with a political party that favored multiculturalism. And from Anders Breivik's point of view, he was trying to do what had been done historically at the gates of Vienna some centuries before, and to keep the Ottoman territory from making all of Europe Islam. And he was afraid that multiculturalism, by promoting all these Muslims to come in and be a part of modern Norway, were doing the same thing. And he had to stop them. He had to stop the Muslim hordes in his imagination. Well, this kind of white supremacy issue is not just in the United States and in Norway. There's a guy, Bryant Tennant, in New Zealand, in Australia and in New Zealand, who were picking up on the ideas of both Anders Breivik and Timothy McVeigh, and did the same thing, and shooting up two mosques in the city of Christchurch. What a horrible thing! What a horrible thing to do. So there is this notion of white pride worldwide, and then political parties that have developed throughout Europe, right-wing parties, to the shock of Germany. Alternative Germany is with very stridently anti-immigrant. Denmark, you know, climbing Denmark. I mean, the Scandinavian countries are supposed to be so welcoming and so loving, and most of the Scandinavians are, and yet there are these movements that are hostile to new immigrants and people who don't look like Danes or Swedes or Norwegians. Austria is particularly horrible that way, and Hungary. Putin has been supported by the Orthodox Church, this old communist who's supposed to be atheist, and yet there's this unholy alliance between the Orthodox Church that has been empowering from Putin, which he's relied on recently in the attack on Ukraine. And of course, all of these have an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant character to them. In India, a Hindu nationalist movement is now in the Bharatiya Janata Party, the leading party of India. There's new movements of nationalism in Japan, and even in Canada with the truckers movement. Recently, you saw this kind of ethnic religious character coming out, even in such a nice place as Canada. You know? So it's truly a global phenomenon, this rise of ethno-religious neo-nationalism, which is a feature of globalization. You know, it's in some ways anti-global, but it's also a feature of globalization. Because in the global era, there are really three issues that I talk about in my book on religious challenges to the secular state, global rebellion. The issue of the issues of authority, who's in charge, everything can be made everywhere, and is the issue of identity. Who are we? If everyone can live everywhere, and you can have neighbors who are from Philippines and neighbors who are from Jakarta and from Taiwan. Who are we? What is a national identity anymore? And security, how can we truly be safe? And so it's no surprise that religion enters this equation, because religion tells you who's in charge. You know, the book and the leaders gives you a sense of identity. It does provide a kind of safe haven of security. So it's no surprise that religion would enter the picture, but it is surprising to see it so weaponized, so politicized by people who then are eager to harness religion for their own ethno-nationalist aspirations. So it raises the question, what's going to happen ultimately? Well, I mean, movements come and go. I just finished a book called I'm trying to remember the name of my own book. The book is When God Stops Fighting, How Religious Violence Ends, based on my study of ISIS, the Khalistan movement, and the Moro movement in the Philippines. Three quite different kinds of movements, but related to religion, that have all kind of ended, although they still continue in some way. The point is, the movements do end. And they usually end because of weaknesses within the movement themselves, infighting. You see this already in the January 6th movement from last year in the United States, where people are fighting among themselves. They now begin to question Trump, whether he's really the great leader that they thought he was. So movements do come and go, but the larger tendency is the one that I think concerns us more deeply. Are we entering into a new era of tribalization? That is, where there's an anti-globalism and a defense of particular ethnicities and particular national configurations in a way that alienates minorities and promotes the people who have the illusion that they are the true inheritors of a particular national identity. Or are we moving that direction? I mean, the elections in the United States that are coming up this year and in 2 years will help clarify, maybe in a tragic way, whether that's the path that the United States will be moving on into, at least for the short run. So that's one very powerful possibility for the future. But, you know, when I look around, and particularly when I see my own students and probably students who are watching this lecture right now, I see people who believe in multiculturalism. I see people who like to think of themselves as global citizens, people who are concerned about the fate of the world. They're concerned about global warming and human rights, and they want to live together with people in peace. They're not narrowly nationalistic in any kind of traditional way. They just want to live in brotherhood and help to share responsibility for this fragile planet, our home. And so that's a very real aspect of both of our present and our future that's not going to go away. So which is it going to be, tribalism or globalism? Well, if you want to know the truth, I think we would do what we've always done in the past. When we've seen a fork in the road, we take it. That is, we take both options. We continue this tension between tribalism and globalization. And we do so within the context of a larger crisis. We muddle through, but also aware that we are now entering into the perils of global warming, with the rising seas and wildfire out of control, the changing climate temperature, the horrible polar vortex that affected much of North America in the last couple of weeks. That we're going to have to work together with others. Yes, we may be more defensive. We also may be closer together at the same time. There may be other crises. Who knows whether the horrors of the Ukrainian battle will issue into some sort of nuclear strike that then imperils the whole world. There are disasters looming ahead that may bring us together closer as a community. At the same time, they may make us more defensive. So the issue of the Taliban and the January 6th movement are only one aspect of a very, very difficult global future. And so, like a Facebook relationship, we can also say that our future is complicated. But at least one aspect of it brings hope as well as the possibility of harm. It gives us some thought that in this rise of tribalism, there is also a vision of a global future that we can share as well. So I've enjoyed bringing you these comments. I appreciate being a part of this larger discussion, and I wish you all well. Take care.
So let me thank you formally then, Mark, for this this wonderful lecture, an engaging and important lecture. I was very excited when you agreed to present to us. Your work is so foundational in this field. I use your books in my course, our Religious Studies 121, which I've entitled Evil. It's really about religious responses to evil in the modern world. And so your books play an important role in that course, in the way that I teach that whole course. What I enjoy about your work and what you've talked about this afternoon is that you tie so much of the harm that people do, not to the fact that they are evil individuals, but they are very frequently in the grip of a violent ideology. That these people are not psychopaths, not unintelligent, not poor and desperate, as many sociologists would have us believe, and in fact not incapable of great self-sacrifice and altruism for what they see as the pursuit of the good. However, your work shows that these members of these groups are in the grip of violent and very often dualistic ideologies that convince them, as you said, that they are in a battle between good and evil, the forces of light and the forces of darkness. So while ideology plays an important role, I think in today's talk and in your work in general, you've shown us your sensitivity to the mythological and religious elements of these movements. That these people, very often social scientists would like to reduce these movements to socioeconomic deprivation or political ideologies dressed up as religion. And in your work, what I find is a real respect for the autonomy and the power of religion and myth in determining people's actions in the modern world, especially in response to the unique forms of evil that we find in modernity. As people in the audience are well aware, in Canada, we are not immune to the rise of this kind of resistance to globalization and its dramatic changes. In fact, one of the graduates of the University of Waterloo's Department of Religious Studies, Carmen Celestini, who now works at Simon Fraser University as a postdoc, has appeared on CNN, PBS, and a host of Canadian networks and media outlets, explaining the connection between the protests in Ontario and Alberta with religion and ideology in terms that I'm sure she would trace back to Mark's work. So thank you, Mark, for shedding light in this fog of, as I said, information, misinformation, and disinformation. You provide a real service, and you have ever since well, in your whole career, but I think especially ever since 9/11, when these issues have become all the more important and urgent. So thank you. And if we were live, at least you could bow to the thunderous applause that I'm sure would follow my